In this session, we're going to cover two New Testament books, and they are the shortest ones we find in the New Testament canon, the books of 2nd John and 3rd John. And we're going to take them in numerical order. The first book we're going to discuss is the book of 2nd John. And as you can see, if you look at it, you see that it's a very short text. In fact, the textbook that some of you may be using as part of the study for this New Testament survey, the book Encountering the New Testament, tells us that 2nd John is the shortest book in the New Testament. But even though it's short, it doesn't mean it's not important. Every biblical book is important. No matter its length, the message is something that God wanted us to know, and so the book is included in the canon of Scripture. New Testament scholar Craig Keener says that 2nd John is about the length of most ancient letters. So if you lived during that time period and you received a letter, not a scriptural letter like we're studying tonight, it would probably be about the length of 2nd John. And Keener also says it was probably written on a single sheet of papyrus. Keener further points out that most New Testament letters are longer than a typical ancient letter would be. Now, concerning authorship, the Bible Knowledge Commentary New Testament, in an entry by Zane C. Hodges, he has written that the book has been traditionally assigned to the Apostle John, though the book is written anonymously, meaning that the author did not identify himself in the course of the text of the book. Encountering the New Testament also says that John has been viewed as the author of this book from the early days of the church. And people who lived closer in time to when the book was composed are in a better place to know who the author was than we are as we live thousands of years later. The letter does not contain the word apostle. Interestingly enough, the writer identifies himself only as the elder, which according to F.F. Bruce is probably a reference meaning that he is an older man. And a little historical background on elders, New Testament scholar Craig Keener says, elders were given authority in local Jewish communities by virtue of their age, prominence, and respectability. Age was respected. We don't know exactly who this letter was written to, but it's possible that at least some of the recipients were not Jewish. We don't know exactly who received this letter or where they were located. Now, the early church also used the word elders to refer to some of the leaders in the early church. And we find multiple references to this. For example, in Acts 14:23, we find that Paul and Barnabas appointed elders in places where they had earlier preached the gospel. And then in Acts chapter 15, verses 2, 4, 6, and 23, which is set in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem Council, all of those verses refer to elders. And then 1 Timothy 4:14, Paul writes about elders. And then in Titus chapter 1, verse 5, he instructs Titus to appoint elders on the island of Crete. And then in James 5:14, there's the reference about elders that if anyone is sick, let him call for the elders of the church. Now, a couple of things about this verse in our text. First, John is the second apostle in the New Testament that we've come to so far in the course of this study, this survey, who has called himself an elder. The apostle Peter did it in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1. In fact, in that verse, he referred to himself as a fellow elder. And second, as Craig Keener has pointed out, the recipients of the letter knew the writer. And the proof of this is that he could identify himself only as the elder, and just with those words, they knew who he was. I suppose a comparable modern-day example would be a pastor sending a card or a letter to one of their parishioners and signing it, "Your pastor." An outsider might not know who the writer of the card was, but the parishioner would. Now, you'll also notice that who the letter is addressed to is a bit vague. The Bible Knowledge Commentary New Testament has pointed out that there are no personal names in the book. From the beginning of the letter to the end, there are no personal names to be found. The book is addressed to the lady chosen by God and to her children. There's no further identification. And because of this, there are some differences of opinion about the identity of the recipients of this letter. And so here are some of the options that have been suggested concerning this. The website Bible.org says that it could be a woman and her children. Our textbook, Encountering the New Testament, says it could be a reference to a woman who let a church meet at her house. And it further says that the lady chosen by God could be a reference to a local church. A New Testament scholar, Craig Keener, favors the local congregation view. The one thing that we can say with certainty is that the recipients of this letter were Christians. Now, concerning the date of the book, like the book of 1 John, we don't know exactly when the book was written. The Bible Knowledge Commentary New Testament dates it in the early AD 60s. However, BibleStudyTools.com, that website says that it was written sometime between 85 AD and 95 AD, and the website Bible.org also dates the book between 85 and 95 AD. Donald Guthrie, in his New Testament Introduction, Revised Edition, says that most scholars date John's epistles in the last decade of the first century. Now, the place of writing, we also can't be certain of, because the Bible doesn't tell us. So we'll turn our attention now to some significant features of the book. The letter is pastoral in emphasis, and what I mean by that is it addresses an issue that was impacting a group of believers. It was directed to a specific concern that needed to be addressed, and John writes to address this circumstance. Now, as we are going to see as we go through these two short letters, they have very different situations presented in them. There's one situation in 2 John, and there's a very different one that we're going to come to when we get to 3 John. And John Stott says that the apostle addresses some of the same things, and they occur briefly in these two letters as they did in the first letter. In other words, he addressed some things in the first letter, and they appear briefly in each of these letters of 2 and 3 John. And one of the themes which recurs in these letters is that of love. We find this in 2 John in verses 5 and 6. The commandment to love dates back to the Old Testament, back to the writings of Moses in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, and it is also a theme that is spoken of by Jesus Christ in John 13:35. There's also an emphasis on truth in this letter. Now, the word truth is mentioned 5 times in the first 4 verses. And John writes about walking in the truth, walking in love, and walking in obedience. And we see this in verses 4 and 6. And by using the terminology walking, you get the idea of consistency. You know, you're continuing along a particular course of action or path. And we are, as believers, to be consistent in our lives for the Lord. Now, one negative thing that can be found in the text, though John does not call much attention to it, is that only some of the believers were walking in the truth. Only some. And I think this is probably true in a lot of churches today. Not everyone who goes and attends a service on a Sunday or any other day of the week, not everyone who walks in the doors of a church is living a consistent Christian life. Now, I know none of us is perfect. We all sin. But there are some people who are very kind of inconsistent in their Christian walk. It hasn't really impacted their life in the way that it should. The reasons for that can be quite varied. But one of the things the New Testament encourages for us is to have a consistent Christian life. Now in verse 7, John speaks about deceivers, and he says that there are many of them. It'd be bad enough if there were a few hidden here or there, but he says that there are many of them. And this is during the first century, when the church is still relatively young, but already deception is being problematic for the new believers. And this problem of deception exists in our time as well. And this is why we need to be discerning. And the interesting thing is that the error that the deceivers are engaged in, that John writes about, is that they deny the humanity of Christ. So if we're speaking in theological terms, they're denying the incarnation. And this is an important truth that should not be tampered with. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in our day, people tend to deny the divinity of Christ. People don't want to acknowledge that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity or that he's God in the flesh. That seems to be the more predominant problem in our day. But throughout the course of church history, there have been various examples of people tampering with the nature of Christ and holding different views that are contrary to Scripture. And John says, if anyone doesn't accept the humanity of Jesus, that they are antichrist, not the individual antichrist that John refers to in 1 John 2:18, but they are antichrist in essence. They're not actually representing the biblical Jesus. In verse 8, he warns his readers about losing their spiritual standing with God. What one believes does matter. The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 spoke about another Jesus, another gospel, and another spirit. And people present these false views of these very important doctrines and truths. Not everyone who says the name of Jesus Christ means the same thing. Walter Martin, who is the author of the classic book on the cults called The Kingdom of the Cults, said something to the effect that when you're talking to a person in a cult, such as the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have to kind of scale the language barrier. You have to define terms, because if you don't, on the surface, it sounds like you're agreeing. And he points out that when you say Jesus, and when someone in an aberrant group, such as the two that I've mentioned to you, says Jesus, on the surface, it sounds as though you're both speaking about the same person. However, upon further investigation, you find out that you are not. And in verse 10, John says that if anyone comes to you and does not bring the true teaching of Christ, do not welcome him into your house. Now, this poses a question for us, and this is a serious question. Does this mean that if the Mormon elders or people from the local Jehovah's Witness group come to your door, that you're not supposed to evangelize them? Or that you're supposed to make them stand out on the porch because you're told that you're not supposed to let them into your house? When my wife and I were first married, we got into an argument because she let some people from one of these groups into our apartment. And I cited this text to her that she shouldn't have done this. But there's an important piece of information that I didn't know about at the time, and this piece of information may be very important to properly understanding what John is saying in this verse, properly interpreting it. Now, when we think of our home or our house, we think of it as the place where we live, and we should, because that's true. That's what we do. We live in this structure. It was true in the days of the first century, and it's true today. However, during the time in which John was writing, houses were also used for church meetings because they didn't have church buildings back in those days. In fact, we have a number of New Testament texts which speak about the church gathering in houses or homes. And these texts include Romans chapter 16, verses 3 through 5, 1 Corinthians 16:19, Colossians 4:15, and verse 2 of the book of Philemon, which is a one chapter book. Acts 12:12 also contains an account of believers gathering together in prayer at the home of a woman named Mary. And Dr. Walter Martin first drew my attention to this regarding 2 John 10. And Craig Keener also notes that this is what could be in view in this verse. And Walter Martin further says that John's instructions to the recipients of his letter not to welcome false teachers into their homes he was telling them not to allow these false teachers a platform in order to promote their false doctrine. Because if you do that, then you're in essence working for the enemy. You're allowing falsehood, false teaching, and false doctrine to be presented in order to deceive other believers. So you don't want to be party to that type of a situation. When I was pastoring, and I pastored one church for 20 years, one of the pastors in the church, I was, someone from a non-Christian church, if I can use that word, contacted me, and they were teaching their young people about different religions or different denominational groups. And they wanted to know if they could visit our church, and our church was a Pentecostal church. And I said, yes, they could visit our Sunday morning service. And in addition to their visit, we would also supply a time during the Sunday school hour in which we would tell them what we believed, as well as take any questions that they might have. And when I mentioned this to the other pastor in the church, he expressed some concern about it. And the reason was that he thought I was going to allow these visitors to teach us. And I assured him that was not the case. They were not going to teach us. We were going to teach them. The personal nature of the New Testament church can be seen in the closing verses of the letter. In verse 12, John prefers to communicate in person rather than in writing. In verse 13, also in some measure shows us the personal relationships were valued in the early church, as John sends greetings to the recipients of the letter from the believers that he is with. And so that brings us to the end of the discussion of 2 John. So now we're going to move into considering the book of 3 John. And as we talk about authorship, we again encounter the same situation that we found in the second letter. The authorship of the book is vague in this book as well. The author does not identify themselves by name, and as was the case in 2 John, he refers to himself only as the elder. Now, in the Bible Knowledge Commentary New Testament, Zane C. Hodges says that this designation is probably a reference to his age. However, Encountering the New Testament says that from the earliest days of the church, it has been uniformly believed that the Apostle John wrote the book. And Zane C. Hodges, again from the Bible Knowledge Commentary New Testament, also accepts that John was the author. So the author of this letter was both an older man and a leader in the church. In fact, he's an apostle, but that word is not used in the text of the book. You know, in Paul's letters, he would say, Paul, an apostle. This book doesn't do that. The word apostle doesn't appear in the text at all. As far as the dating of this book, the information regarding the date is the same as the other two letters. It was probably written during the last decade of the first century, as Guthrie has mentioned in his reference book. Now, as far as the recipient of this particular letter, unlike 2 John, which was written to a group of people, this letter was written to an individual named Gaius. However, trying to identify the Gaius that's being spoken about here is difficult because Craig Keener says that the name Gaius was a very common name. But it seems that John had a very good relationship with this man. He calls him dear friend 4 times in the letter. He does this in verse 1, verse 2, verse 5, and verse 11. He speaks well of him twice regarding his faithfulness in verses 3 and 5, and he also commends him for being loving in verse 6. So we're going to look at now some of the significant features of the book. Donald Guthrie has noted that there is an emphasis on truth in this letter. And this truth emphasis is something that we saw in 2 John, and it's also present in this letter. John mentions truth 5 times in this letter. In verse 1, verse 3, verse 4, verse 8, and verse 12. Now, if you're using the NIV 1984 edition, you're going to have an additional reference to truth because in that particular translation, they use the word truth 2 times in verse 3. Craig Keener refers to this book as a letter of recommendation for Demetrius, who's mentioned in verse 12. Now, before proceeding, I'd like to speak briefly about verse 2, which says, Dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that you all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well. Now, there are some people that seem to think that this is a prayer promise. This is God's will for us that we be prosperous and healthy. But remember something, this document that we're considering is a letter. And New Testament scholar Gordon Fee, who is a Pentecostal, has pointed out that what we find in this verse is akin to what we might write in a letter today. And this is what he says, and I quote, I pray this letter finds you all well. And he further says that this was a standard form of greeting in a personal letter. So as many scholars have reminded us, texts mean what their authors meant, and we need to read the verses in context. If we're not doing that, then they can be made to say things that the biblical author never intended. Now, one of the issues in 2 John was believers welcoming people who shouldn't be welcomed. But the issue, or one of the main concerns in 3 John, is the church not welcoming people that should be welcomed. And in this letter, it's a matter of hospitality, that is supplying lodging and food to believers who are traveling. And as you'll note in verse 5, the people that are traveling are strangers to the people that John is writing to. But they're supposed to offer hospitality even to these people that they don't personally know. This was important in the first century, and John Stott, citing W.M. Ramsey, Ramsey writes, the ancient inns were little removed from houses of ill fame. So these were not good places for Christians to stay in the public inns. And John Stott goes on to point out that it was normal, or natural for traveling Christians to be put up in the homes of the members of the local churches. Now, Gaius was doing the right thing with regard to these traveling strangers. He was welcoming them, and John heard about it and commended him for it. We see that in verses 5 and 6. In doing this, he was working for the truth. So if you have, as a church person, ever taken a missionary into your home or a traveling minister and offered them hospitality, a place to stay, food to eat, you too have been a worker for the truth. However, even though Gaius was behaving in this way, not everyone was doing this. There was a person who's mentioned in the book, and this person seems to have had some prominence in this congregation, who was not welcoming them. This man's name was Diotrephes. He would not welcome the traveling Christians. We see this in verse 10. He also put out of the church the people in the church who wanted to welcome them. Also found in verse 10. And so this one man is kind of messing up the church. And sometimes that's all you need to have a problem in this church, is one individual who's out of step with the will of God, and they begin to set a bad example and lead people down a wrong path or take matters into their own hands, such as this man is doing, in that he is behaving in a way which is contrary to the instruction the Apostle John gives in this letter. Diotrephes is a biblical example of toxic spirituality, indeed toxic leadership. He seems to have exerted what some have called dictatorial control over an assembly, and that's not a good thing. And this problem still exists today. We need to watch out and make sure that it doesn't happen in our churches, or even worse yet, that we do not become an individual like this, like Diotrephes was. John says plainly in verse 9 that this man loves to be first. Stated differently, he has a pride problem. And pride and control can become problems. Diotrephes had a real heart problem. His heart was not right before God, and this was evident in the way that he treated people. His heart was not right toward people either. And his behavior was contrary to Jesus' words in Matthew 20 about not lording it over people. This man was doing just that. He was not a servant of the people, but a slave driver. And Scripture tells us in Proverbs 3:34, James 4:6, and 1 Peter 5:5 that God stands in opposition to the proud, but supplies grace to the humble. God surely opposed Diotrephes, and John said that when he visited the church, that he would call attention to what this man was doing. In other words, he would deal with him. I once wrote an article for PentecostalPastor.com that you can find on the website called Toxic Leadership. And in addition to referring to Diotrephes as toxic, I also referred to him as abusive and a bully, which is kind of common terminology in our day. It has no good connotations whatsoever if somebody is bullying. And the case of this man raises a question in my mind, and the question is this: where were the other elders? At least some churches in the New Testament seem to have multiple elders. We see this in Acts 14:23, Acts 15 verses 2, 4, and 6, Acts 20 verse 17, and Titus 1:5. If this church had multiple elders, how did this man rise to such a place that he had this much power and control in the church? Because as some writers have pointed out, when you have multiple elders, it helps the ministry to be shared so that one person is not unnecessarily burdened. And it also provides a measure of accountability so that a situation like this really doesn't come into play. Apparently, if there were other elders, and we don't know for sure, no one stood up to this abusive individual. But in contrast to Diotrephes, we read about Demetrius, who was commended by everyone, by the truth, and by John. And this letter ends in the same way as 2 John. John has much to communicate, but would rather do so in person rather than writing, and he extends greetings from the Christians he's with to the Christians that are in the location that he writes to. So this concludes our consideration of 2nd and 3rd John.